One of the features that distinguishes the EU from more conventional international organizations is the broad scope of its policymaking competences. But at the same time, the EU also faces fundamental constraints as a policymaker. What are these constraints, and how do they shape EU policymaking?
Yes, indeed, the EU faces fundamental constraints in policy making, and these constraints result from the fact that the European Union is not a sovereign state.
And what does that mean in practice?
In practice, this means the EU cannot independently decide on its competences. It's always dependent on transfers of competences of the member states. That means the consent of the member states to transfer such competences. And this consent is visible in the treaties, which define EU competences in various policy areas. But since member states are generally reluctant to expand policy making at European level, they often did not transfer full competences to the European level. And that means the treaties define the areas where the EU has only shared competences with the member states, and in some areas it has even only a cooperative role vis-à-vis the member states. Also in legislation, which is paramount to substantiate policies, the European level is dependent on the consent of the member states. And again, this consent has to be given in many cases by all the 27 member states, or in other cases by a qualified majority, and the consensus is just difficult to achieve. Then a second fundamental constraint lies in the fact that the EU cannot independently decide on its revenues. That means it is not allowed to levy taxes according to its preferences and needs. The revenues of the EU, the financial means, are transferred by the member states in regularly intervals, and the member states then very toughly negotiate on how much to transfer for which policy area and so on. So again, they look at their individual benefit and not at the Union as a whole, and this means an enormous dependence of the Union. Then a final fundamental constraint results also from the fact that the Union is not subordinated to the member states. That means it cannot prescribe anything to the member states, and that means it cannot enforce compliance. So it depends always of the willingness of the member states whether compliance is achieved.
Could you use the comparison to Canada to illustrate the constraints on EU policymaking? To what extent is policymaking in Canada less constrained than EU policymaking?
Yes, the difference is Canada is a federal state. That means full sovereignty lies with the federal level. And in the EU, this relationship is inverse. The member states are the ones who are sovereign, and they transfer from the lower level, let's say, competences to the European level, and that makes the European Union so hardly dependent on the member states. And the problem is also the member states are not a unitary actor like a federal government, and that means again that they have to achieve consensus to transfer competences, and if one or two or three member states are not willing to do so, the things cannot happen.
In broad strokes, how have EU policymaking and governance evolved over time?
Since the beginning of the 1950s, EU policymaking has rapidly evolved at European level, and the mode of governance have also evolved, partly with governance modes which rely on soft modes of governance or innovative modes of governance, which do not need formal competences and powers. So we distinguish four phases in this evolution. A first phase was very limited to a few interventions in selected areas, but at that time the EU used, or the European Community used, hierarchical modes of governance. A second phase is characterized by the expansion of European policy making and also by first experiments with shared competences at European level and more flexible forms of governance. The third phase, by contrast, is characterized by an enormous expansion of European policy making, and there we see both hierarchical modes of governance, mainly in the area of the single market, and also a lot of innovative forms of governance, cooperative forms of governance in other areas which were hitherto domains of the national level. Also a fourth phase is marked primarily by the sophistication of coordinative and cooperative modes of governance, but also by the strengthening of compliance of the member states, and this time through indirect but effective steering instruments, for example, conditionality. On the whole, we can conclude that EU governance and policy making evolved in adaptation to the EU as a multi-level system, relying even in case of hierarchical modes, on cooperative modes of governance or on shared competences. Not shared competences, but shared cooperation with the national governments.
You have described the evolution of EU policymaking as a process of trial and error, but also as a process in which the EU has come up with some innovative approaches to addressing the constraints that it faces as a policymaker. Could you give an example for one of these innovative forms of governance?
Mm-hmm. Indeed, the European Union has developed a host of innovative modes of governance, but the most prominent among these is the so-called open method of coordination. This method implies a sequenced procedure involving the European level and also the national government level, and even sometimes in some policy areas the lower levels. The EU in this process assesses national action plans and policy achievements and formulates recommendations to individual member states. The member states, for their part, have to draw up their action plans and also to submit reports on their policy measures and achievements in the respective policy areas. And the whole process is accompanied by benchmarking, peer reviews, and the exchange of best practices. And that means the EU mobilizes, in this case, also competitive pressures on the member states to comply.
So, all in all, how effective would you say the EU has been as a policymaker? And which factors have influenced its effectiveness?
Looking at the effectiveness of EU policymaking reveals a mixed picture. In single market policies where the EU has far-reaching competences and addresses directly the economic sphere, the effectiveness is rather high. But where the EU addresses the governments of the member states, the effectiveness is mixed. And the effectiveness is not guaranteed in these cases, even not in those cases where the EU has far-reaching competences or can exercise hierarchical governance. So the effectiveness of EU governance depends in the member state depends to a large extent of the willingness of the member states and the capacities to implement European policies. The willingness, for its part, depends on whether member states perceive EU policy making as beneficial to their country, and the capacities depend on whether member states are able to implement innovative governance mode. That's to say, whether they have the political and administrative capacities to do so, and also whether they have experience with such governance modes. And we must say, in many member states, mainly or especially those which have recently accessed the European Union, these preconditions are largely lacking. So that is a problem for the effectiveness of EU policy making.